Thank you, Aisling, for that great introduction there. And yeah, I'm delighted to be here with everyone today. Let me just share my slides. Um, okay. Now, can everyone see that? Is that okay?
Yeah, can see that perfectly.
Perfect. Okay. Um, yeah, so my name is David Kelly. And yeah, I this presentation is based on a research paper I wrote that was published in May. And the title of that paper is Black Mirroring and the Paranoid-Schizoid Simulacrum, Scrolling as a Defense Against the Depressed Position. And I know that's a mouthful, and there's a lot of psychoanalytic jargon in that title. So, one aim I have for this presentation is to unpack that and explain the thesis of my research in more understandable language, basically. Um, and basically, what my thesis offers is
I've just been traumatized. I'm took me an hour to get here. I've been all over Green Hills, Robin Hood.
Just
Oh,
like
this
to
is a
ask,
very hard place to
I think
find.
somebody isn't muted there, so if you wouldn't mind just muting yourself.
yeah,
Great. Sorry about that, David.
no problem at all. So basically, my research offers a theory of why we scroll, why we struggle to stop, and why we feel worse afterwards. And this isn't a grand theory of scrolling. I'm not. It's not trying to explain why everyone scrolls all the time, but rather why I think many people scroll a lot of the time. Um, so yeah, that's how the presentation is broken up. So the first part explores why we scroll, the second part is why we struggle to stop, and then the third part is why we feel worse afterwards. So let's jump into the first part, why we scroll. Um, so kind of the core proposition of the first part is that often we scroll to avoid experiencing distressing thoughts and emotions. And another way of saying that in psychoanalytic kind of language is that scrolling is a defense mechanism. Um, so a guy called Herdi wrote a paper in 2023, and he proposed that scrolling can function as a defense mechanism. And it sort of begs the question, okay, what is a defense mechanism? Um, so Kramer defines a defense mechanism as a cognitive operation, the function of which is to modify the experience of a distressing thought or feeling. Um, so Herdi proposed that when we're scrolling, we can also be doing this. And he called scrolling as a defense mechanism flowing, as in we are unconsciously flowing through an algorithmically curated content feed. You know, you open Instagram, you open TikTok, you open Facebook, and you scroll through a kind of almost infinite flow of videos or posts. And that we can do this as a way of avoiding distressing thoughts or feelings. Um, so I interviewed, for my research, it was qualitative research, and I interviewed 8 people who reported habitual compulsive scrolling that they found distressing. So you could say the defense mechanism for them had kind of stopped working. They were feeling distressed by the fact they were scrolling. Um, and those participants reported scrolling to avoid anxiety, stress, boredom, low mood, self consciousness, feeling intimidated, vulnerable, or like a failure, or undesired reactions. Um, and they said that scrolling was used to soothe, to switch off feelings, to escape, to distract oneself, disconnect from oneself, or disconnect from a looming shadow, enter a shutdown mode. So this is how people kind of describe what they're doing when they're scrolling, or this specific group of people. Um, so one criticism that's often leveled at the term defense mechanism, ironically, is that it's too mechanistic a term. Um, so Jonathan Shedler, he's a psychodynamic therapist, and he proposes that defense mechanism is actually a misnomer. It's kind of the wrong kind of way of thinking about it. It's the wrong term. Um, and rather that defense is better thought of as a verb rather than a noun. So like defense is not a thing, it's not like a box, it's not an object, but rather it's a continually unfolding process woven into one's personality. So defense is a process, and it's a process that begins in infancy when we're born. So I let's take a look, I think, at how defenses can develop. So the idea is that they start in infancy, and they start often as a behavior, as a motor reflex. So let's imagine we have a distressing event, and let's imagine we have a little infant, and his name is Johnny. And Johnny is confronted with this distressing event. And Johnny doesn't have that much at his disposal, but one thing he does have is his body. So, Johnny can turn his head, or Johnny can close his eyes. And that's, in a way, how Johnny defends against a distressing event. So it's a motor reflex, and it's an embodied response, not looking or shutting your eyes. And that functions to allow Johnny to defend against this distressing event. So let's imagine, we have another distressing emotion, event, or thought. Johnny's a bit older now. Johnny's 8 or 9. And Johnny has a verbal capacity now. And so now Johnny doesn't have to look away or close his eyes, but Johnny can deny that it's happening. So Johnny can say, well, look, that's not happening. And you can see, although he's denying it, he still looks quite upset or shocked about that. So you can see that's a classic defense. It's called denial. And you can see, like, it although he's using his verbal capacity, it has evolved. It's playing the same function as not looking or shutting your eyes. Rather, you're just using your verbal capacity to not look at the distressing emotion, event, thought. You're shutting your eyes, but you're using your verbal capacity to do that. So you can see it kind of emerges out of that very primitive motor response. And let's imagine now Johnny's a bit older. We have another distressing emotion, event, or thought. And now Johnny's an adult. Johnny's a professor at Trinity, let's say. He's a professor of philosophy. And Johnny now has a very sophisticated intellectual capacity. So now Johnny, he doesn't have to look away. He doesn't have to close his eyes. But rather, Johnny can make an argument for why he shouldn't feel upset. Why he shouldn't attend to that distressing emotion, event, or thought. So Johnny says, it would be illogical to feel sad about that. And in that way, Johnny is still not looking at the distressing emotion, event, or thought. Johnny's still, turning his head, but he's still building a wall. But now he's using his intellectual capacity to do that. So you can see there's a developmental continuity of the defense here. And that's kind of how this process of defense, the idea is it starts off in infancy as sort of an innate capacity, like a motor reflex. As we develop, more sophisticated capacities, like a verbal capacity, it can become something like denial. And then as we develop even a more sophisticated intellectual capacity, it can develop into rationalization, a very common defense, very common way of avoiding or not acknowledging something that's upsetting is to rationalize it away. So taking this kind of developmental frame, let's apply this to scrolling. So let's imagine another distressing emotion or event, and this time we have Paddy. And Paddy has a very sophisticated imagination, and children, are very imaginative. It's a capacity that develops quite early on, and it can be a way of avoiding something that's distressing, like an emotion or event. It's often called withdrawal into fantasy. So you play with toys, or you can read a book, and that helps you construct your own fantasy life. And if something distressing is going on at home, the child can withdraw into that fantasy world, and that can be a way of defending even against something distressing. So what I propose, so let's imagine now that Paddy is a bit older, and there's another distressing emotion, event, or thought. And this time, Paddy lives in the 21st century, and Paddy has a phone. And what the phone allows Paddy to do is, rather than withdraw into his own fantasy life, Paddy can withdraw into a digital fantasy. Paddy can withdraw into social media. So it still plays the same function as withdrawing into your own fantasy life, but rather than flowing through the contents of your own imagination, you're flowing through the kind of collective digital fantasy contents, like those short videos or posts or tweets and stuff like this. So the scrolling which flowing, which is scrolling as a defense mechanism, as a defense, kind of emerges, I think, from this innate capacity we all have to kind of withdraw away into a fantasy life. So the developmental continuity of scrolling as a defense or flowing is, I propose it emerges out of this innate kind of early capacity we all have to withdraw into fantasy. And the technology kind of scaffolds off that capacity. And I guess it brings me to the end of this first part. And I think that one of the key points I'd like to make that I think is a pernicious thing about scrolling is that in scrolling, we've outsourced our fantasy to algorithmic content feeds. So rather than withdrawing into our own fantasy life, which can have a lot of utility, in a normal sense, we're withdrawing into the algorithmic content feeds, into a collective kind of digital fantasy. And this brings me to the second part of this presentation, which is why we struggle to stop. And to understand why we struggle to stop, to understand the psychological state induced by scrolling, I propose we must ask, what is the psychological world of the infant like? And this takes us into object relations theory and the paranoid-schizoid position. So again, that's a kind of jargon term. I'm not going to, for our purposes, I don't need to unpack the kind of historical reasons why it's called that, but basically a psychoanalyst, Melanie Klein, proposed that the experiential world of the infant has several characteristics, and she called it the paranoid-schizoid position. But these characteristics are as follows. So one is that the infant splits other people into all good and all bad part objects. The second is that the infant's world is dominated by fantasy. The infant experiences time as a series of fragmented, discrete moments. And the infant experiences a sense of omnipotent control over the world. And emotional and cognitive maturity occurs when the infant moves into the depressive position. So I'm going to unpack all of these sentences here piece by piece, because I know there's jargon there also. So just with the first piece, so splitting and part objects. So Melanie Klein proposed that the world of the infant is characterized by splitting and part objects. An object is kind of an unfortunate kind of term. Basically, when you see object, you can read person. Object is kind of used in the sense of he is the object of my love, or she is the object of my hate. That's kind of the sense in which object is used, but it basically means people. So Klein proposed that the world of the infant is characterized by splitting and part objects. And the reason for this is that the infant doesn't perceive whole people yet, only parts. And the idea is that the first part that the infant perceives is the breast, the part that feeds the infant, because that's the infant's main concern is being fed. And again, not every caregiver breastfeeds, and not every caregiver is a female, but so you can kind of, in a large sense, it is metaphorical, this idea of the breast, because it could be, bottle feeding. And even a bottle, if you look at a bottle, it does look, the top of a bottle does have a nipple kind of shape, and that's not accidental. So that's the idea, is that the first part is the breast, and that in moments of being nourished, the infant experiences what Klein calls the good breast. So it's like this idealized, all good, gratifying part object. And you can see that in the image there. And then in moments of frustration where the infant, maybe is frustrated or not being fed, or this is moments where the infant experiences what Klein calls the bad breast. So it's a devalued, all bad, frustrating, withholding part of the person, of the caregiver. And the reason that these are kept split is that it would be too painful for the infant to contaminate the good breast with the bad breast, so they're kept separate. The idea is that for the infant doesn't have the cognitive capacities yet to come to the realization that actually the person I love and the person who nourishes me is also the person I hate and who frustrates me. So they're kept split at this time into part objects. And Klein proposed that the infant matures into whole object perception, so the ability to perceive whole people, by internalizing a good object. So emotional maturation involves realizing that the mother is a whole person, is both good and bad, gratifying and frustrating. And the mother, is the first other in her life. So this becomes a template, or the mother, the caregiver, the primary caregiver, is the first other in our life. So this becomes a template for how we relate to other people. And this occurs when experiences of the good breast outweigh experiences of the bad breast. So you can imagine from the infant's perspective, there's moments where I am of the good breast where I'm nourished, and moments of the bad breast where I'm frustrated. So you can see, nourishing here, frustrated, nourishment, nourishment, frustrated, nourishment, frustrated, nourishment, 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 frustrated, nourishment. It's a very simplified way of looking at it, but it's something like that for an infant. And this can be described as a pattern of caregiving experiences. And you can see in this particular example, it's a pattern of attuned and responsive caregiving. Mirroring, another way of saying it, it's mirroring by a good enough mother. It's not perfect. There are moments of frustration, but it's good enough. It's mostly good. It's mostly attuned and responsive for the infant. And this experience of a pattern of attuned and responsive caregiving is internalized by the infant as what's called a good internal object representation, or a good internal object. And this is essentially a working model of self, other, and the world, similar to what David was actually talking about in his presentation. So you can see in this image, we have the self as loved, the infant is cared for. We have the other as loving, nourishing, caring. And we have the world as safe. For the infant, really the world is the caregiver. And in this particular instance, the infant feels safe. And this representation, this internal representation, becomes the basis of positive self-esteem. I am loved for and I'm cared for. You kind of believe this at a deep level. Emotional regulation. You come to believe if I'm upset, I can be comforted. This won't last forever if I'm upset. And a capacity for positive relationships. Others are mostly good. Most of the time, others are good. Therefore, I can trust others to be good and bad. And that kind of helps the infant to overcome splitting. I no longer have to keep the good and the bad separate. You can kind of accept the ambivalence in people. And, often, just as a side note, often people who have borderline personality disorder often had a lack of good objects in their very early life. And for that reason, we're not able to internalize a good internal object that kind of helped them overcome and not rely on splitting so much as a defense. So another thing that a good internal object does, and Donald Winnicott proposed this, is that it fosters the capacity to be alone. And this is also relevant for scrolling. I know I haven't mentioned scrolling in a while, but it will circle back. But the good enough mother also fosters the capacity to be alone. So basically, imagine the paradox of being alone with another. So that's the idea, is that, I'm alone with a non-intrusive, non-impinging other, a caregiver. And by internalizing that, the infant internalizes this experience, and that inculcates the capacity to be alone. You then experience solitude as replenishing, and this is distinct from withdrawal or loneliness. You can, in moments of being alone, you can draw on the good internal object, that deep sense of being loved and cared for, and it makes those moments nourishing rather than, frustrating. And in this sense, the good enough mother fosters individuation. The good enough mother fosters the infant to go out into the world and not rely on her for emotional regulation and for positive self-esteem entirely. And this brings us back finally to scrolling. So Aaron Balick, he's a UK psychoanalyst. He proposed that we have outsourced our capacity to be alone to our phones. This was evident in my research. Participants consistently reported scrolling to fill the time or to pass the time. And in these in-between states, participants reported scrolling to rest or to recharge or to warm up. or when transitioning from one state to another. For example, when from going asleep to waking up, or from work to rest, task to task, participants withdrew into a soothing kind of infantile world that was curated by the algorithms on their phone. So you can imagine being alone now. Most of the time when we're alone now, this is, I think, an experience that almost everyone shares. We start flowing, we start scrolling. That's how we cope with being alone. Many people today, and in this sense, building off what Balak has proposed, that we've outsourced our capacity to be alone to our phones, I rather propose that we've outsourced this capacity to the algorithmic systems that curate the content we see when we're scrolling, so that these systems have replaced our internal good objects. And rather than promote individuation, the aim of these systems that have been designed by social media companies, the aim is to sustain our attention. It's to sustain dependence, not to promote individuation. So I spoke a little bit about mirroring, and I'm just going to compare that with what the concept that I propose that's called black mirroring. So feelings signal our emotional needs. For example, when I'm feeling sad, it signals that I need to connect with another person, for example. And in mirroring, a good enough mother is attuned, a good enough caregiver is attuned and responsive to our infant's feelings. And this helps the infant to process and understand them. So it provides a relationship where the infant can learn to know what her needs are and how to meet them, because another person has recognized what my needs are. And through that recognition, I can come to realize what my needs are. So this is mirroring in a nutshell. Now, in my research, participants reported scrolling often in response to a feeling, and specifically, for example, anxiety, sadness, or boredom. So you can imagine someone is feeling sad or anxious, and they scroll, and then they feel soothed, they feel a little better. And what happens is the editorializing algorithmic systems, the system that's curating the content being shown, soothes these feelings by attuning to what content stimulates the user's attention and responding with more content like that. So, you shows another piece of content and that's soothing, and then maybe it shows a piece of content that we don't like and that's frustrating. And with each piece of content that we watch, that we like, that we dislike, the algorithmic system learns what will sustain the user's attention and shows more content like that. So it shows another piece of content and that's soothing. Another that's frustrating, it learns, don't show another piece of content like that. Shows another soothing piece of content, soothing. And ultimately, it learns what, will grip our attention, and implicitly what will soothe us when we're distressed. But the key point is how it's different to mirroring, this black mirroring, is rather than attend to our feelings and help us meet our needs, like a good enough caregiver or a therapist. These systems learn what short-form content will stimulate to distract users from unmet needs. And this is the process I call black mirroring. And black mirroring, there's kind of three reasons for that term. One is that, the black mirror of your phone, when your phone is turned off, it kind of looks like a black mirror. It's kind of a juxtaposition for mirroring by Winnicott, and also the show Black Mirror, it's about kind of a dystopian sci-fi situation. So whereas the goal of the good enough mother is to move us from the paranoid-schizoid position to the depressive position, the goal of the editorializing algorithmic system is to sustain our attention. So to do this, it curates short-form content, so short-form videos, TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, memes, tweets, X-posts. And this short-form content elicits short bursts of disconnected emotions like joy, anger, sadness. And it's fragmented. It's not coherent. It's a very fragmented experience, like how an infant experiences the world. It's content that we like or that we dislike, content that soothes or frustrates. They're only 30 to 90 seconds long a lot of the time. And the goal of the system is to keep us immersed in this content, immersed in this infantile digital world of splitting. Like the infant perceives things as all good or all bad. When we scroll through social media, it's things that we like or things that we dislike. So in this sense, David Hinchcliffe called, this social media or these algorithmic systems in this sense, the idealized digital breast, the phone as a source of nourishment, as something that feeds us, or the devalued digital breast, the frustrating phone, the phone that doesn't feed us. And in this sense, the algorithmic system behind our content feeds, I propose sustained splitting. And this was borne out in my research. So when I asked participants to describe the relationships with their phone, they described it as if they were infants engaged in splitting, or adults engaged in splitting for that matter. So as the idealized digital breast, the phone is exciting, comforting, beneficial, helpful, necessary, provides a fun, a joyful kind of bubbly experience, a comfort blanket, a safe space. And as the devalued digital breast, the phone is ambivalent, enslaving, trapping, unfulfilling, exhausting, bittersweet, burdensome, distant, uninterested, hindering. And like the breast, like the thing that feeds the nourishing caregiver, the algorithm plays a soothing and a frustrating role. And in that sense, it's experienced by users as split. And just some more information from participants. So they describe the experience of scrolling or flowing. On aggregate, while flowing, participants reported a sense of timelessness, a rapid cycling of affective states, primarily dominated by interest and low cognitive load. So it's a very fragmented, low cognitive kind of headspace to be in. For example, participants described it as being stuck in a time loop and out of consciousness, mindless, numb, zombifying state that they simultaneously experience as the intriguing chase of dopamine hit with a wide range of emotions that they microdose on. This is how participants described that state. Additionally, the state isn't particularly memorable, with one participant stating, in the last 10 minutes, I can probably tell you 1% of the information that I took in, and it's not even useful. I'm just conscious of time. One participant said that the algorithmic system, it'll never know me because so much of the stuff that happens is not me. I started to realize that my relationship with my phone is very much a relationship with myself more than the actual people around me, because it's just kind of feeding into you all the time. So again, that piece about feeding, being fed with content that we like, that's gratifying, or content that we don't like, that's frustrating. And this is what I call the Paranoid-Schizoid Simulacrum. So it's kind of a simulation of this early state, this early infantile state. So in mirroring, a good enough caregiver provides a relationship where we can come to know and meet our emotional needs. And in black mirroring, an algorithmic system simulates an infantile world that soothes painful feelings at the expense of knowing and meeting our emotional needs. And I'm just going to, one last piece of this is something called omnipotent control. So in ordinary development from the infant's perspective, the world operates according to his beck and call. So the baby experiences him or herself as being omnipotent. This is called omnipotent control. So you can imagine, when I'm hungry, I'm fed. When I'm uncomfortable, I'm made comfortable. And from the infant's perspective, it's literally like the world is, operating when the infant wants it to, so the infant's world environment is literally the caregiver. So when the caregiver is attuned and responsive, it's as if the world itself is responding to the infant's needs. And to wean the infant out of this illusion, the good enough mother engages in what's called optimal frustration. So just to go back to this pattern of caregiving, you can see it's not perfect. There are frustrating moments. And ideally, there's a pattern of optimal frustration. And this allows the infant to mourn the loss of omnipotence, that the world doesn't operate according to my beck and call. And this helps inculcate a capacity to tolerate frustration, which is a developmental achievement. And this brings the infant into what Klein calls the depressive position. So the infant comes to realize, the child comes to realize, I'm not the center of the world. There is no perfect other that provides endless nourishment. I am responsible for how I act. Eventually, as an adult, I have to work and sacrifice to live. The good object is also the bad object. The person I love is also the person I hate. And the world is not black and white, it's gray. And so, though depressing, this is a developmental achievement. And I propose that in scrolling, in black mirroring, because it's omnipotent control is simulated. So those systems are not designed to frustrate you. They're designed to constantly keep your attention. So they're optimized not to frustrate you. They're optimized to always nourish you. And I propose that's what people are seeking when they're scrolling. That's why it's so soothing, is that it's an ideal digital breast that simulates this omnipotent control that was very soothing in our infanthood. So in mirroring, a good enough caregiver provides a relationship to facilitate her infant becoming an individuated, emotionally mature person. In black mirroring, an algorithmic system soothes the user by simulating an infantile digital world that they can regress into anytime, anywhere. That's the difference between those two concepts. So just to recap, the infant starts in the paranoid-schizoid position. It's characterized by these characteristics, and then moves to the depressive position that is characterized by these characteristics. And this is facilitated by a good enough caregiver offering a mirroring relationship. And my thesis is that as adults, we often occupy the depressive position. And when we scroll, we engage in black mirroring with editorializing algorithmic systems behind our content feeds. And they place us in what I call the Paranoid-Schizoid Simulacrum, which is characterized by those kind of infantile characteristics. And I will finish, I know I have a few minutes left, I will finish on time. Just the last section here is why we feel worse after, and it's the shortest one. So the depressive position. So all participants engaged in negative self-evaluation after scrolling due to a perception of having lost time that could have been spent on activities that are productive, creative, relational, or meaningful. So they reported feeling shame, cognitive dissonance, frustration, disdain, depressed, disappointed, unmotivated, embarrassed, annoyed. And this reflects the participants' return to the depressive position. So they were in the paranoid-schizoid simulacrum facilitated by black mirroring. And after they stopped scrolling, they returned to the depressive position, which is basically reality-based life. So the depressive position has been characterized as a terrible, ruined world where the loved object is in pieces and a sense of deep despair. So you can imagine it's like there's no ideal breast that offers perfect caregiving, there's no perfect unity with another. So if just consider the following participants' experience after scrolling in light of that. So one participant said, you just watch your living environment becoming more and more dirty and degraded and messy, and this will have a negative effect on you as well, and everything kind of spirals. So I propose this is because they were in a relationship with the idealized digital breast, with black mirroring, and inevitably that's frustrated. You can't be there forever, so you're back to the depressive position. And I propose that because the infantile digital world we experience while scrolling is so unlike the real physical world, we're experiencing moving between them in the same way the infant experiences emotional and cognitive maturation. Participants scroll to disconnect from their conscious goal-directed reality, retreating into a regressive phenomenal world that avoids the demands of integration and responsibility. So one participant described it as a way of dismissing responsibilities, goals, and shutting off purposeful directed activity, running away from the responsibilities. 2 clicks and you're seeing something that takes your mind off the here and now for a second or for as long as you want. And a fourth said, I don't have to be in my body or be in my head. I can be separate. It happens to escape responsibility. And in this sense, and this is just at the end, that scrolling is the ultimate defense mechanism, that black mirroring is the antithesis to counseling and psychotherapy. So feelings signal the emergence of an emotional need. And in therapy, like the Good Enough Mother, as counselors and therapists, we provide a caregiving relationship where clients can explore their feelings to discover and better meet their needs. And in scrolling, editorializing algorithmic systems provide a pseudo-caregiving relationship where they soothe users by simulating a digital world where feelings are fragmented and disavowed. And in this sense, scrolling is antithetical to counseling and psychotherapy, insofar as it provides a completely new way of being that can be entered at almost any time, that in that state, it prevents the emergence of distressing thoughts and feelings. And implicit in those thoughts and feelings is the possibility of understanding and the possibility of growth. So in this sense, I think that black mirroring is the opposite of what we do as counseling and psychotherapists. And just in conclusion, I guess what I would hope that you get from this presentation, I got an email from a master's in counseling and psychology student in India after this was published. And this person wrote to me and said, that they had used that this research had provided a helpful framework for group counselling. Many could resonate with the idea of a black mirror. Your framework provided a structure to open up that dialogue and to help the group explore the behavior on a much deeper level. Through increased awareness, we were able to address clients' phone addiction by encouraging more meaningful phone use, with more mature participants opting to delete social media while socially enriching alternatives like group walks, yoga, and creative outlets such as pottery workshops were suggested, especially considering the schizoid traits. So yeah, I know I'm just at the end. That's what I hope this offers. I hope it offers just a way of thinking about, what's going on when we're scrolling, what it's kind of doing to us, both personally, and perhaps what it's doing, to clients who might come when they struggle with phone addiction or compulsive phone use. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. And I hope that was interesting, and it's a pleasure to speak to you all. Thank you.